On this day, March 8th, the day women came to the streets and changed the meaning of the year. The snow had started early that winter. By dawn, the city looked white only from far away. Up close, it was gray, dirty, and crowded with footprints. The air bit at the nose. Bread was still a word everyone used every hour, as if it could hold a person up on its own. In 1917, Petrograd did not wake slowly. It woke with noise. A church bell here, a truck there, boots on stone, and the thin whistle of factories starting the morning shift. Inside a textile workshop on Viborg side, women worked with stiff hands and short tempers. They tied bundles of fabric that smelled like oil and dust. They stood in heat and then back in wind. Their mouths were often quiet in front of the foreman. They learned very early that quiet meant less punishment. But on this day, even quiet was hard. Maria, who had once learned to read only the names of soap and salt on labels, had gone to bed with her child coughing for the third night in a row. Her husband, Ivan, had gone to the docks weeks before, hoping the army order system would be more stable than factory pay. His letters had become shorter. Sometimes they came with a stamp only, no words. Outside, the bread line had already formed before sunrise. A woman with wrapped hands in a heavy dark scarf shouted toward a bakery window, not angry at first, just tight with need. "Again? No flour today?" A man at the front of the line answered with his head shake. "Today no less than yesterday." Maria stood for a moment, not in front, just at the side near the wall, and watched people trade pieces of information like ration tickets. A loaf was not just food. A loaf meant time. It meant peace if you could buy it. It meant one less argument at night if you could bring it home. At lunch, in the women's room, Anna folded her sleeves and said it out loud. "We don't just need bread, we need to be heard." No one answered at first. Then Tatiana, who worked in a printing office and read everything she could, said quietly, "Heard is not a word for those who have no time." A few women looked up from their tools. "You can shout 'heard' and still be invisible," said Lydia, who had 2 older sons and one very angry back. "At home we hear enough. In front of men we are still in the background." Silence came again, but it did not last long. Around 2 p.m., a rumor moved faster than the steam. The rumor was simple and therefore dangerous. Some workers are stopping for the afternoon. Not all? No, not all, but enough. Enough for what? Enough to walk. By 4 p.m., the walk had begun. Not all at once, not with banners, no music, just a narrow stream of coats, a shawl wrapped like armor, feet stamping through dirty snow, a mother carrying a baby, 2 sisters sharing a sandwich, a printer's assistant carrying a parcel of ink-covered paper. Men at first looked away. Then they looked back. Some thought it would end by noon. Some thought this was just another protest that would pass, but it did not end. One old tram driver later said he remembered the sound before anything else. Not slogans, not police shouting, not even shouting. He remembered the sound of many quiet voices moving together. The women did not shout at first. They asked for what they needed. They did what they could. "Bread and peace," Anna said, almost as if she were reading a line from a page she had memorized long ago. Around the corner, a second group joined in. From a matchbox factory, from a canteen, from a smaller district where the roads were narrower and smoke was thicker. A worker from a clothing shop crossed herself and said, "If they do not hear the first line, we can repeat it, but we must start." By the time twilight came, the crowd had crossed streets that had never seen them before. The city map was no longer for men in offices.
It was made by footsteps. A police lieutenant watched from under a wool hat. "Disperse," he said to a second officer. "Not a mob, just lines," the officer replied. "You always think this is how it starts. It ends in arrests." A small boy, old enough to run messages but too young to carry blame, heard it and kept running anyway. He had no clear task. He just moved from group to group, carrying names that moved like warm coal. Bread line near the river, a second group near Narvaska, 3 women taken at the corner, no food cards for 200 people after tonight. By night, the city had changed in the way only cities change when people stop waiting. Windows stayed open a little longer. People spoke to neighbors through the cracks between doors. At one corner, a policeman and a woman stood facing each other in a narrow lane. He held a baton low. She held a folded paper with a red mark on one corner. "Go home. This is not your place," he said. "Last week they told us to stay. This week we are here." No one moved for a few heartbeats. Another woman stepped forward and held out half a loaf. "Will you take this home and feed your child?" she asked. The policeman looked at the loaf, then at the crowd. He did not answer. His hand stayed still. And that was enough. Not enough for history, perhaps, but enough for courage. The next morning, the city looked like a body after fever. Exhausted, angry, no longer surprised by its own noise. Some men blamed wives for making trouble. Some women blamed men for making a war they did not need to win. Some people stayed silent and went to work, because survival makes people learn many kinds of silence. In one block, Ivan finally returned for one day after his shift near the docks. He found a note on the door in careful, uncertain writing. "Don't worry, I'm fine. We are not begging, we are showing." He did not smile. He did not even read it twice. He held it like it might burn. At the printing office, Tatiana copied notes from workers, letters, police statements, and rumor into long lines. She crossed out words that sounded too angry, then crossed out quieter ones that made no sense. She knew every newspaper had a rule. If it was ugly, write it small. If it was useful to the state, write it big. If it was risky, delay it. But there is one kind of risk that does not ask permission, when many people walk in one direction. By noon, one report reached a desk where an editor pretended he was above politics. "Factory unrest," the message read. "Small disturbance. Female workers at textile plants. Demands around bread, wages." He looked at the page and set down his pen. "Call it routine," he muttered. His assistant did not obey. He typed a second version. "Women marched today," it said. "Not many were armed. They spoke clearly, and they stayed in groups. Several districts joined by evening." "Too much," the editor said. "Just accurate," the assistant replied. "Words, too, can march." The next night there was another line in the cold, not as long as before, but deeper. A butcher's wife gave up the edge of yesterday's bread for children she did not know. A school guard let a group pass the side alley. A tram conductor waited longer at one stop so old women could climb aboard. None of that list sounded like revolution, but nothing in history sounds like revolution when it is first happening. In some homes, children slept later than usual because adults did not stop talking. In some barracks, men argued whether what they heard was a real movement or only winter noise. In one cramped room with one lamp and 3 coats hanging on a cracked wall, Maria sat with the other women and listened to another rumor. Some factories will shut. Some families will lose pay. Some will go to prison. She folded her blanket tighter and touched the sleeve of the baby she still carried, sometimes on her lap and sometimes in her arms. "I have done this before," said Lydia, now coughing from smoke and worry. "Not with crowds, but with days that change. There is always a day that asks too much." "What day asks too much?" Maria asked. Lydia shrugged. "Any day when you are the first to stand in the street." Around the city, authorities moved with the speed of people trying to be faster than their own fear. By the next 2 days, there were meetings. By the next week, there were lists. By the end of the month, those lists had names, no face attached. Some who had shouted were pulled from lines and questioned. Some were released before supper. Some were not. A pair of men in a station corridor asked one question over and over. Who called this? No one gave a full answer. The women had not built a formal committee with clean minutes and perfect signatures. They had built something quieter and harder to catch. A route, a rhythm, a promise. At home, fathers heard that promise as threat. At home, mothers heard it as breath. At home,
the city heard it as a new sound, not silence anymore. The quiet turning. Spring came slowly. In speeches later, people argued over years and slogans and the correct names for the days. Some wanted one date, some wanted another. Some wanted a day for remembrance. Some wanted a day for rights. Some wanted to claim the movement before it moved them. But this was all after the fact. Before that, there had only been the walk. The walk was short. It had no anthem. It had no full plan. It had no guarantee. And yet it had a strange power. When ordinary women from ordinary streets repeated one simple demand, it stopped being private need and became public truth. Many later books would write bigger timelines than this city could remember, and bigger names than this room had known. Still, if you go to one old photograph from the time, you will not see a perfect poster. You will see boots, hands, coats, babies, and paper wrapped in cloth. You will see, more than anything, faces that look surprised by their own courage. Many years later. Years passed. Other wars came. Other governments wrote new orders. Other people took that day and made it theirs. In some countries, this date was used for one kind of politics, in others for another. Some added flags and speeches. Some added ceremonies and flowers. Some added one red line and one white line and called it progress. What they all carried forward, though, came from a simpler grammar of life. People were hungry. People were tired. People could not stay silent forever. A rumor had become a road. A road had become a memory. And then a memory had become a date. By the time the idea traveled farther, there were conferences and organizations, and people in different countries repeated the date with pride, anger, tears, and plans. But in streets where the ground was still uneven and expensive shoes still split at the heel, those details did not matter as much as one old truth. The day was not important because history wrote it. The day was important because women had walked anyway. The day the story would not close. In a small apartment years later, an old woman watched a radio broadcast and laughed at the formal words. The host used a big phrase, polished and careful. She closed the door quietly and turned down the volume. "They make everything sound clean," she said to her neighbor, "as if courage is easy." The neighbor asked, "Was it really this hard?" The old woman shook her head. "It was hard," she said, "until it looked like it was not." Outside, young women walked by with books in their hands.
Inside, her neighbor asked again, "And did it all change?" The old woman answered without raising her voice. "Not all at once, but a long road begins in the first day where enough people stop waiting." She stood by the window and watched the street lights. The day grew darker. The lights stayed. No one who had stood there forgot the cold. No one forgot the loaf. No one forgot how quickly a quiet city can turn into a crowd. No one forgot that a day can hold a line from one person to millions of years. Years after the march, new girls studied, women taught, workers argued, mothers negotiated, students marched again, old voices returned to the same words and changed them. Bread and peace. Those two words, simple as they were, would keep changing shape. Sometimes bread meant wages. Sometimes it meant dignity. Sometimes it meant equal rights. Sometimes it meant safety. Sometimes it meant a place at the table. Sometimes it meant a life where a child did not go to bed hungry. The meaning was never fixed because life was never fixed. And still, those women were still there inside each new sentence, not as statues, not as perfect examples, but as people. People who had felt cold, people who had carried babies and anger together, people who could not wait for permission. Closing scene. If you stand at the same stretch of old city streets and close your eyes in the middle of winter, you can still imagine the sound. Not drums, not speeches, just feet on damp boards, many feet, then more feet, and maybe one of them saying, in a voice not loud but clear, "We are here." Another answer far back in the line, "We are still here." The city did not become kind in one day. It did become harder to pretend. That was how the date entered memory. The story does not end when the crowd disperses. It ends only when the next person forgets the names. And every year on March 8th, somewhere in the world, someone remembers. Not because they learned a lesson, because one day people were so tired of being unheard that they learned to stand together anyway. And that sound, once heard, does not disappear.
Part 2. The Day After the Crowd.
The week after the first big march was colder than the week before. That is how many stories begin in memory, not with a firework, but with weather. By dawn on Monday, a small stack of notices had appeared at 2 factory gates. One line was stamped by the office, another by a local authority. No one could read both the same way. Some doors had names with no wages. Some doors had names with warnings. Some doors had names with silence. Maria did not open the notice at first. She stood there with her fingers on the wood, watching others. A woman from the far end of the building came forward with a scarf pulled under her chin. "She says if we go in one by one, they will cut us apart," the woman whispered. "If we go together, they will only cut at the front." Maria laughed once, short and sharp. "So we keep going together," she answered. It was not strategy. It was plain stubbornness. At noon, only half the shift showed up. At sunset, almost none. At night, they gathered by district gates and discussed who had gotten letters from employers, who had no pay, who had disappeared. One name was repeated. Annie from the dye room had not returned from questioning. 2 sisters from the weaving group spoke at once, both crying. Tetyana wrote down all names on a page she tucked under her coat. "Do you still want this?" she asked Anna, as if asking a question about money, not freedom. "What else is there?" Anna said. "If we go silent now, tomorrow there is no story to tell about this day." And so a second march happened. This one was smaller. This one had no excitement. This one had eyes open. It had mothers who knew names of courts and inspectors, not just slogans. It had boys who had learned to carry papers and not get caught. It had workers who looked less like protesters and more like tired families deciding what to do with a dangerous morning. When police met them again, some officers looked angry and some just looked tired. One old officer recognized Maria. "You are the woman from the bread line," he said. She looked at him. "Not just one woman," she answered. He stared for a moment and then stepped back. They never used words for victory that day, but in some places they let the group pass. In some places they blocked. In some places they did both, because a city can be one mind at one hour and another in the next. This was how the movement survived, not by becoming brave all at once, but by staying alive long enough for the next day.
Part 3. Rumors become records.
Every city learns how to survive by making a record of what it fears. In Petrograd, fear had a name and a typewriter. In a press room 2 blocks away, an editor read 2 versions of the same report. "Do not use the line about women leading the crowd," he said. "Then say who led it," Tatiana answered. He smiled in a way that meant tired sympathy and old habit. No city uses the right word until it is forced. Tatiana did not answer. By evening, the official copy said this was a minor labor disturbance. The copied sheet said it was organized only by a few agitators. But in another room, in a notebook with no title, one man copied the same events with names and streets and temperatures. He wrote, "Cold day, many women in factory quarters, bread line central to all statements, no formal order but repeated movement." And below that, people watched and learned. The notebook was passed quietly from hand to hand, each reader adding a line, each line carrying forward something that did not fit into official language. A year later, some of those notes would be quoted by someone else. Another year, they would be quoted by those who had never seen them. By then, maps become stories. Some maps are precise. Some maps are emotional. But all maps begin with one line you cannot erase. Part 4. What the date carried forward. The date did not stay in one place. It moved. First to meetings, where delegates argued in rooms with too much smoke and no windows. Then to newspapers in other cities. Then to schoolrooms, where girls copied the date in the margins. Then to speeches, where men gave the same phrase different meanings. And slowly, without asking permission, the date left the city. In one coastal town, a teacher wrote the event in a diary and underlined the words "bread and peace" 3 times. In another town, a clerk copied them into a report that was shelved and then rediscovered by a union group. In another city, activists marked March 8th on a calendar and wrote nothing else beneath it. Still, one thing kept changing inside the date each time it traveled. How to say the same grief in a new language. How to turn hunger into a public request. How to make private struggle visible.
In Vienna, in Berlin, in Paris, in factories and schools and offices, people said, "This is not only a day about one event, it is a day about one idea." Not the same idea every time. Sometimes it was voting. Sometimes it was wages. Sometimes it was education. Sometimes it was safety in war. Sometimes it was the right to stand without permission. Yet underneath each version, the old sound remained, a line of voices in cold air, a question no one could answer quickly, a door left open by people who were usually left out.
Part 5. A Morning in Another Year. In another year, much later, at another border, there was a girl who would have grown up to become a clerk, a teacher, or a nurse. She was 12 when she first heard adults argue over the date. She liked to stand near the kitchen door while the grown-ups talked. "Was it always this way?" she asked. "No," said her aunt. "Then why remember it?" "Because if you do not remember, it happens again in another shape." The girl did not fully understand. Years later, she would work in a room where women were paid less and told not to complain. She did not remember every detail of the old march, but she remembered the date. She remembered that in that date, hunger had walked with dignity. Years later, she carried 2 children and 1 old notebook. On March 8th, she opened the notebook and read 2 names on a line. She did not read all the story. She read the part that mattered most to her. People had walked. The world was much bigger in her life. The people were different, but the sound stayed. In a different city, a bus driver kept an old photograph in his jacket, not of famous people, of women standing near a gate with no uniform, no stage. He showed it to his daughter. "They walked because we cannot feed our hearts with silence," he said. His daughter asked, "How do you know it was true?" He pointed to one face and said, "That woman there, my mother had this face when she said no." People laugh at old stories sometimes. They say stories get bigger than life. They call it exaggeration. But the truth in a city can be this: not a single miracle, 1,000 little decisions, and a date that keeps returning when people feel forgotten.
Part 6. The slow expansion of a memory.
By now, the date had become a marker, a line in calendars, a heading in reports. What began as one winter day became many years of naming. Some governments treated it as ceremony, some treated it as politics, some used it as decoration, some used it as warning. But in homes, the date kept a quieter life. Grandmothers told children, "If you need help, do not wait for permission." Fathers said quietly, if someone asked, "Maybe we should listen first." Workers said, if wages are unfair, we should gather again. Students said, if our future is promised and never paid, we should ask again. And women who had never spoken in public repeated the old line for their own daughters. Not always exact, not in exact grammar, just enough. Bread and peace. Each time it changed, something about the phrase changed too. The phrase stayed simple. Its meaning moved.
Part 7. A city morning, long later.
Decades passed before the first formal programs became global, before banners were printed with clean fonts, before slogans crossed borders by radio and book. The city where it began had changed its name, then changed names again in official records. Many buildings did not survive.
Many people did not. But if you walk through old streets now, you can still find a woman standing by a bakery in a painting, or a line in a local story, or an old man with a scarf remembering that day with a face that looks both proud and relieved. Not all of them remember details. That is not how history keeps its strongest memory. It keeps this: a person finally spoke. A group then echoed. A city learned not to look away. On one corner, someone places flowers each March 8th. On another corner, no flowers, only work. On another, speeches. On another, silence. None of them are complete. Each is a part. And perhaps that is true for every date that mattered. Not one owner, not one perfect version, just many people carrying one memory from one street to another.
Part 8. The Long Walk.
When people ask if that day changed the world, the answer is hard. A single day cannot change every life, but a single day can change what people consider possible. In Petrograd that winter, the impossible was to be heard. By that evening, not everything was won. Some women lost wages. Some had to face fines. Some families went hungry for longer. Some were punished for names and faces they did not even know. Still, the impossible became less impossible. Now, people knew what it looked like when ordinary people stood together in the cold, naming hunger as a public issue. Now people knew that the city could be crossed by those who were not invited. Now people knew that a date could hold both pain and promise. And in quieter lives, in kitchens and buses and small offices, the date was quietly used again. Not always on a calendar. Sometimes in the way one woman spoke up in a meeting. Sometimes in the way one girl stayed 1 hour longer in class. Sometimes in the way one mother said, "I will not send my daughter back with fear." The march had no final line. This story always keeps moving because March 8th does not belong to one year. It belongs to every morning where people ask for better words and better days. In a modern apartment, a person reads an article with polished language and bright photos of modern celebrations. The words are polished, but the room has its own weather. Outside, someone delivers groceries. A child asks, "Why do they celebrate this day?" The elder in the room opens a drawer and finds an old scarf. Not decorative, just wool and stitches. He puts it on the sofa and says, "Because in one city, long ago, people were too hungry and too brave to be quiet." The child asks one more question. Were they famous? No one answers at once. Then the elder smiles. No, that is the part that matters. The camera in a modern room fades to black. The next city wakes to another morning. The streets are cleaner now. The cold is different. The hunger is older, newer, and still alive in different forms. And somewhere in the distance, if you listen very carefully, you can still hear it. Not loud, not perfect, just feet stepping together, not sure what comes next, but certain that staying still is not an option. The sound is never old. The sound is still happening, and every time it happens, it returns to the same date, March 8th. A date, yes, also a doorway. A date is only a number on a calendar until a day like this proves it can be a road. Within the same season, people in other places heard versions of the March 8th walk. Some thought it was only a local protest. Some called it a labor event. Some called it war fatigue. Some said the headlines exaggerate. But in workshops, canteens, and railway yards, women compared what they had heard with what they had lived. A seamstress in one district said, "They are saying this happened somewhere else. Why not here?" A teacher in another city wrote in a letter, "If women can walk in cold wind for bread, maybe we can ask for classrooms that last to adulthood." A nurse in a port city marked the date in the corner of a prescription ledger, then told a friend, "It is not charity, it is a door we open for each other." The date did not demand one language. It gave people a calendar word they could carry across borders. Some nations used this day to celebrate the same line with festivals and parades. Some used it to negotiate with lawmakers. Some used it to teach children about public courage. Some used it to remember losses with quiet meals and no speeches. It did not always look right the first time. It was argued over, renamed, edited, repeated, sometimes ignored. But that is what history does when it is alive. It does not stay inside one city. It needs translation, not just language translation, life translation.
Long after the old bakery queues and tram corners, there is a girl in a modern station waiting for the night train. She has an earbud in one ear and a notebook in her hand. She is studying for a test she does not believe in, one that asks for clean answers and no opinions. Next to her, a woman in a blue coat asks if she can sit by the window. The girl nods. At 5:10 p.m., the station speakers announce a delay. The woman smiles and says, "March 8 is coming." The girl looks up. "For class project?" she asks. The woman laughs softly. "For survival first," she says. She tells a story in short pieces. How her grandmother once stood in a winter walk with no fear of being seen. How her father later used that memory to start a workplace conversation. How schools in her city mark the date with debates, poems, and sometimes empty speeches. The girl listens with one earbud still in. When the train arrives, they stand together. No one says the old phrase. No one needs to say it. But the girl writes one line in her notebook anyway. March 8 can still be a beginning. In another part of the world, a market opens with loud colors and loud music. A small sign says today is a day of remembrance. A volunteer gives out tea to women who have worked night shifts. No one asks them to explain history first. A man from the neighborhood sets out chairs. A school principal adjusts a microphone. A group of students hold a banner that says equal opportunities, equal rights, equal safety. The words are new. The feelings are old. Some of the women there laugh. Some cry. Some just stand and watch. All of them feel something small and difficult and bright at the same time. The date has become broad. Too broad, some would say. Not broad enough, others say. But dates are not fixed statues. They are crossroads. And at a crossroads, too many feet can meet. Some people use the day for photographs. Some use it for arguments. Some for policy. Some for love. Some for grief. But in every version, one line returns from the old city and older women. No one was born with a microphone. Most started by just walking. That does not make it small. That makes it real. A city was changed because some people decided hunger was not a private mistake. A group refused to stay in a line meant for the powerless. A date became a marker because it had to be remembered by workers in kitchens and streets. That is all. And the all of it was not over by dusk. The date stays open. Every generation carries it in a new hand. If you stand very still on a winter morning and listen carefully, you can hear it. Not as a slogan, as footsteps.
as one more person joining, as the sound of many ordinary voices building into history. On this day, there is always room for one more voice.